Now for the last section, I'll kind of circle back around and try to approach this work from just a slightly different perspective. The production of art in Adivasi culture is traditionally governed by ritual protocols, totems, memorial pillars, and so on. Here the object's manufacture, the labor of its making, is swallowed up by its ceremonial or mnemonic function. The object is as natural and in create as the gods it signifies, or merely a vehicle for commemorative reflection. Dialogue's collaborative process had the effect of reframing the object and making visible the labor of its production in new ways. In particular, their workshops encouraged a recognition of the necessary contingency of the object, an attention to the object not as a vehicle for the transmission of some a priori meaning, the authority of a god, the memory of a loved one, but as something produced through certain formal techniques and stylistic norms. In making these conventions and the agency of the artist who deploys them visible, they also raised the possibility that these same conventions might be subject to change or transformation. And that's the relevance of that quote that I began with. Did everybody read that? Did you have time to read that quote? So remember that quote, right? All right. Because if I have to go back, it'll take too long. All right. Because they talk about that a little bit, the quote. Okay, from the contingency of the created object, they move the contingency of the rituals and institutions that structure village life, and it is this playful, transformative spirit that led to the Pilagudi and the Nau Park. If ritual constitutes one axis of object production in Kondogaon, the second is provided by the trade in Adivasi and tribal crafts among the agents and dealers who service metropolitan galleries, collectors, and art fairs. And this is Jaidev Bagal, who's a very famous Adivasi artist who has a workshop in this village, near this village. While some production for local ritual and worship still occurs, the bulk of the demand now comes from the urban international art market. Althoff and Dialogue have worked closely over the years with the Adivasi sculptor Jaidev Bagal, whose workshop trains dozens of young artists in bell metal sculpture and casting techniques to meet this demand. Bagal's sculptures incorporate traditional Adivasi themes and motifs, animal forms and gods and spirits and geometric patterns that have existed for thousands of years. In fact, it is this very sense of integration, of Bagal's affiliation with an unbroken Adivasi tradition which appeals to collectors. The work performs a kind of nostalgic reenactment of pre-modern India as a pastoral gemeinschaft. If the artist's agency and the process of production are effaced in ritual, they are fetishized by the market. Bagal acts as the living embodiment of an ancient tradition in which the artist conveyed venerable truths in a common symbolic language. At the same time, he's under continual pressure from the corporate collectors in the major cities to change the look of his work, to make a particular figure, for example, larger, to put bison horns inappropriately on another animal god because that will look more interesting to them. So on the one hand, they want to kind of consume Adivasiness. On the other hand, they kind of want to reconstruct Bagal as a kind of protean modernist artist who's constantly developing formal innovations with these motifs that have existed unchanged for centuries. It's a very interesting dynamic. In this dynamic, Adivasi culture functions as the static, unchanging antithesis to India's chaotic modernity. Whoops, going the wrong way. That's the Shilpigram, which is Bagal's workshop space. As I've noticed, Adivasi communities today are riven with distinctly modern forms of conflict and exploitation. But the discourse of tribal art discourages any direct reflection on or representation of this experience. We encounter here one of the central structure and oppositions of modern art as it defines itself against the grain of the pre-modern. The pre-modern artist is in this discourse wholly integrated with his culture. There is no gap, no distance in the signifying relationship between the artist and society. But the artist pays a price for this intimacy and interdependence. He is entirely subordinate to that culture, incapable of independent or critical thought, de-individuated in the warm but stifling embrace of the collective. The modern artist, on the other hand, is an emblem of the pervasive alienation of modern life, no longer able to identify with the values of his own society. The loss of his former sense of belonging is compensated for by a new critical capacity that turns that distance to his advantage. His relationship to society becomes detached, critical, and ironic, the fearless individual holding out against the repression of a hegemonic mass culture. The pre-modern artist functions here and I'll use Bagel as an example, in a supplementary or subaltern capacity relative to the modern and implicitly Western artist. Bagel's relationship to Adivasi culture, for example, can never be reflexive, distanced, or critical, only dependent and mimetic. While the modern artist must jealously guard his expressive autonomy against the imposition of shared or collective values, in contrast, this relationship is structured by a set of oppositions that operate along both a spatial and a temporal axis. On the one hand is the shift from the artist submerged in the collective to the artist autonomous and distanced from the collective. And on the other is the shift from art that simply replicates or transmits dominant values to art that disrupts, critiques, or challenges those values. These resolve themselves into a set of ethical and aesthetic oppositions that privilege individuation, critical distance, and change over collectivity, integration, and stasis. And that's what this diagram is trying to map out, if you can read it. The temporal register on the top contrasts the pre-modern and the modern. In terms of relationship to tradition, fixity versus change, stasis of thought versus the generation of new insight, meaning given versus meaning problematized. And a really good example of that is the way in which the Adivasi collaborators started to reconceptualize their understanding of memorial pillars in the region. And when I talked to Shantibai, she said they used to look at the memorial pillars and they just never thought that somebody made that. They thought it was just always there, because memorial pillars have one function, which is to memorialize someone who has died. And she said after the experience of the workshops, they started to look at the pillars very differently and recognize the marks of a particular artist, a craftsperson who made this pillar and made these decisions about how this pillar should be constructed and what the design would be and so on. And then the spatial register has to do with proximity or distance between the individual and the social, or an individual and a collective kind of set of cultural values. Integration and distance. The pre-modern artist is subordinated to the collective. The modern artist is free and autonomous. The pre-modern artist, their work can only ever affirm dominant values. And so the movement in this always goes from left to right. This is understood as progress. And what I want to argue, although I don't really have time to do it in this relatively short talk, is that there can also be a kind of diagonal movement in which in some cases distance can produce fixity. And in other cases, integration can produce new insight, so that we can complicate this notion of a kind of unilinear progress in the construction of modernity or modernism in art. We have a narrative that celebrates the triumph of the expressive individual over the collective, of innovation over tradition and autonomy over independence. Creative agency in this analysis only retains its generative power when it is consolidated in a singular individual. Once it is shared, distributed, exchanged, or negotiated within a larger social body, its critical acuity is dissipated. Only a single monadic consciousness, epitomized by the figure of the avant-garde artist, can originate a form of revolutionary insight capable of challenging habitual forms of thought and power. I would suggest, however, that it's possible for creative agency to be de-individuated without diminishing its critical or transformative power. In fact, I would contend that this capacity can actually be enhanced if the experience of creative agency itself is treated in a more reflective manner. The projects of dialogue involve neither a proprietary relationship to agency nor its absolute disavowal. Instead, we encounter a process by which agency is left deliberately unguarded, both claimed and relinquished, while retaining its ability to reframe a given reality. Here the act of expression is generative and contingent. Rather than transmitting a pre-existing content, expression takes place through an unfolding process among an ensemble of collaborative agents. The locus of creative production is displaced from the level of independent ideation on the part of the artist to an indeterminate, collectively authored exchange among multiple interlocutors. The relative autonomy of each participant is alternately diminished and enhanced as the subjectivity of the viewer, distanced, critical, receptive, fluctuates with the subjectivity of the producer, immersive, haptic, collateral modeling. The artist's mode of perception stands as the telos towards which the viewer aspires or by which they are guided. The viewer's feedback as such is seldom a significant factor, and even their presence before the work is understood only hypothetically. Collaborative, or what I'll call dialogical practices, involve the co-presence of bodies in real time. They encourage a heightened awareness of bodily schema, our capacity to orient ourselves in space relative to the world around us, and an increased sensitivity to the process by which our bodies feel, relate, and produce meaning. Further, they revolve around an experience of reciprocal modeling, as each subject shifts roles, anticipates, mirrors, and challenges the other. In the same manner, these groups conceive of sight less as a reservoir of formal or representational material that is ready to hand, than as a space in which action is constituted and reconstituted on an ongoing basis. Hans Joas, in The Creativity of Action, describes what he terms the meaningful loss of intentionality that occurs when we relinquish some degree of rational control due to the ambiguity or emotional quality of a given situation. It's something he takes from Merleau-Ponty. We might speak then of a meaningful loss of intentionality in dialogical practice as the artist opens out to the effect of sight, context, and collaborative other. Here, the mindful surrender of agency and intentionality is not marked as failure or abandonment of the prerogatives of authorship or the specificity of art, but as a process that is active, generative, and creative. In dialogue's work, for example, critical distance is produced out of the interactions that occur at a given site. This distance is always partial and contingent, coexisting with moments of relative integration or proximity in a diachronic unfolding. Insight is generated not via distance per se, but in the play that occurs between these moments. On the one hand, dialogue's projects evolved out of a deep knowledge of Kondogawa, accumulated through years of observation, interaction, and coexistence. They didn't approach the craft practices of the area from a position of exteriority, seeking to critique or dismantle them as symptoms of the regressive conservatism of village life. Nor did they romanticize them. They learned how to work productively within these traditions, even as they were able to maintain a productive distance from them. A recognition of the contingency of the crafted object opened out into a broader exploration of the plasticity of craft itself as a form of social architecture that could be mobilized to reshape village protocols. Their work is based neither on a claim of seamless integration with Adivasi culture, nor on an equally absolute distance from it. Rather, it affects a kind of toggling back and forth between inside and outside, engagement and observation, immersion and reflective distance. This cognitive movement is produced through the physical, discursive, and haptic experience of shared labor among dialogue's members in the conceptual development and fabrication of the Naupar and Pilaguri, and in their common habitation in the village. It is parallel to and entwined with a pragmatic, applied labor necessary to design and construct the sites. The effect is a co-laboring of sorts that is displaced from normal routines and reflectively conscious of the village as a social and spatial totality. It is a labor that is grounded in and oriented towards a practical end, the creation of a pump site, but at the same time not merely programmatic or mimetic, the physical enactment or reproduction of a pre-existing plan. Rather, the collaborators are conscious of the process of design and creation as provisional and generative. This labor is not realized or subsumed solely in the final product, the completed pump site, but in their own transformed consciousness of the village. How are we doing time-wise? I've got a couple of more pages. I could stop now, or...
We have about 10 minutes now.
You want me to go on, or take a break? What's best? Your preferences?
Keep going.
Okay, you're not falling asleep. That's good. Okay, I'll get through this, and then it's just like a kind of concluding bit. The workshop is a site at which village social protocols are both reinforced and potentially destabilized. While Jaydev's workshops at Shilpigram didn't exclude women, the normative conventions of art production in the village ensured that they continued to function primarily as assistants to men rather than working as artists in their own right. In many cases, village women had to take jobs in farming, construction, and brickmaking in order to support their husband's art production. Any challenge to the male prerogative in art making was greeted by derision, hostility, and even violence. Shantibai's husband, and this is Shantibai, a well-known woodcarver named Raitaram, was ridiculed by the other men in the village when she began making her own sculptures. He resented the attention that she received, and they eventually divorced. The identity of the artist was not given for Shantibai, but rather was something she had to consciously claim and reinvent. In this process, she turned to the Adivasi tradition of the memorial pillar, which was, as I mentioned, typically used to commemorate a dead relative. Shantibai transformed the pillar, using it to mark and situate her own life story. She created a series of cylindrical columns combining memorable scenes and incidents. A drunken mason dangling from a scaffold, her first time ever in a car. Rajkumar has a motorbike, so there's Rajkumar without Najat on the back of the motorbike, into an unfolding visual narrative, and that's actually her telling me the stories in that picture. Into an unfolding visual narrative. This reauthoring of self involved a claim of expressive agency, but it also had the effect of changing the nature of Adivasi art. Inspired by Shantibai's example and Althoff's encouragement, several of the women who had been supporting or assisting male artists in Kopaveda began to produce their own work. Dialogue's workshops are premised on the concept of craft, not as a fixed tradition, the impoverished antithesis to the exemplary virtuosity of the modern avant-garde, but as a cultural practice that can be amended, transformed, and reconstituted. It is this recognition of the underlying plasticity of craft and its reciprocal integration with a complex network of social and cultural conventions that differentiates Dialogue's approach from the workshops of Jaidev Bagal at the Shilpigram, which are primarily technical and oriented towards meeting the demands of the market. At the same time, the replicability of craft practice is essential to the social operation of the workshop. Craft knowledge is discursive and transmissible. It is a skill that can be taught and passed on, and in so doing it provides a platform for shared labor that can be used to mobilize new relationships. The workshops initiated by Dialogue encourage the emergence of new temporalities and new forms of social interaction. Their work requires the kind of deep understanding of sight and the social structures of village life that comes with long habitation and a recognition of the full complexity of craft and artisanal production. At the same time, it requires an understanding of craft, gender norms, or caste divisions as something available to be reshaped, redeployed, and experientially tested. Throughout this process, Althoff has consistently sought to problematize her own position within the collaborative team as an urban, non-Adivasi artist. Althoff, Rajkumar, Shantibai, and Gisaram developed a set of performative protocols to guide the decision-making processes necessary to work together creatively and minimize implicit hierarchies, acknowledging different forms of communication, written versus verbal, differing notions of time and duration, models of decision-making, kinesthetics, and other conventions. Any collectively generated written material, like statements or so on, is produced by transcribing a series of conversations, circulating the transcripts and discussing them in subsequent conversations, and engaging in further revision. They also work together to collectively define a series of keywords related to their practice. Words in the Halbi, which is the dialogue, the dialect in this village, they don't speak Hindu. Some people speak Hindu, but a lot of them only speak Halbi. So the Halbi words for interaction, labor, criticism, and dialogue. These keywords that expose some of the significant conceptual and cultural differences between Hindu and Adivasi culture. In her work at Kandigaon, Althoff has refused the role of the nomadic provocateur who appears briefly at a given site, stages an intervention, and then departs. Nor would she claim to speak with any absolute authority on behalf of Adivasi or peasant experience in India. Both positions effectively bypass the question of ethics. The first by claiming a capacity for ironic detachment or critical distantiation that ostensibly renders such questions irrelevant, and the second by assuming a natural correspondence between the artist's interests and those of his or her collaborators, and both positions are equally naive. The point of attending to the specific epistemological and material effects of collaborative labor and dialogue is not to effect yet another reversal, privileging dialogue and physical interaction as somehow more authentic or less instrumentalizing than textual or speculative modes of experience. It is rather to understand what is different about these modes of interaction as a form of creative practice. To speak, as Irigaray reminds us, is never neutral, nor is bodily knowledge or interaction ever outside power. While Althoff, Rajkumar, Shantibai, and Gisu have made a concerted effort to acknowledge differences of power and privilege, the fact remains that Althoff's class and caste status, she's a Sikh and she's not Adivasi, so she's seen in the countryside as of a different caste, and the caste distinctions in the countryside are extremely important, not so much in the cities in India, but in the countrysides they're extremely powerful. Remains that her class and caste status, as well as her position as a metropolitan artist, have provided her with opportunities that are unavailable to her collaborators. At the same time, this privilege is ambivalent. When Althoff, oh, and this is her glasses. This is, there we go. That's, you don't see people with glasses in the village, so they're remarking. She kind of was fascinated by Althoff's glasses all the time. At the same time, this privilege is ambivalent. When Althoff first arrived in Kondogaon, she was treated with a superficial deference due to her caste, but she was also viewed with considerable suspicion for the same reason. Jaidev and many of the male artists at the Shilpigram were especially resistant to her extended presence, fearing that she was there simply to appropriate Adivasi forms and styles. In the thinly veiled criticism, he complained to Althoff that, quote, all the failures from the city come here, take advantage of this place, and then go back to get romanticized and become famous, end quote. Notwithstanding the fact that Navjot chose to remain in Kondogaon and that she had already achieved fame as an artist before her arrival, Bagel's comment reflects a legitimate fear of the colonizing tendency of urban artists in India and elsewhere. Taken in conjunction with Althoff's willingness to question gender relationships in Kondogaon, encouraging the movement of women into art production and intervening when she would witness incidents of domestic abuse or violence in public, the result was a lengthy period of subtle and not so subtle hostility among several of the men in the village towards her work there. It was only after several years of sustained engagement and the demonstration of her commitment to Kondogaon as a site of practice and not simply a reservoir of stylish indigeneity that Althoff was able to build a network of collaborators and establish sufficient trust within the village community to work in a sustained manner. Differences of cultural capital, access, and mobility inevitably had an impact on her interactions with the village, as well as her reception in the global art world. They are unavoidable precisely because Althoff has chosen to work across boundaries of class and caste. The goal of dialogue as a group is not to magically dissolve these tensions or to produce some ideal and unconstrained model of community, but rather to make the negotiation and the working through of difference an explicit part of their practice. Thank you very much.